I'm Elena Bellina with Matteo Brera, and we were very pleased to see so many of you yesterday with us. We were a pretty good and consistent crowd following the event, and we had very lively discussions, so we were really pleased with that. And today, before we start with the conference, just a couple of announcements that we will repeat in the afternoon. But first of all, this conference was born as a follow-up to a previous MLA roundtable this past January. And in the same spirit, we announced then, and we are announcing now, that we want to create a research group of people interested in captivity studies or social justice in Italian culture, especially in the last 150 years, roughly speaking. So we will reach out to the speakers, to the participants who are interested in these topics after the conference. And the same way, Matteo, right, we've been talking to publishers at the MLA convention who are really interested in this kind of mixed approach to this field of study. So again, we will reach out to speakers and other people after the conference about this project. Right, Matteo? Yeah, we got very positive feedback already at the MLA convention. So we look forward to working with you on this. And Matteo, shall we start? Would you like to introduce yourself too again?
Again? Yeah, well, do you have to?
Why not?
You didn't introduce yourself.
Oh, well, that's true. So I'm Elena Bellina. I teach Italian at the University of Rochester, the Eastman School of Music, and I co-organize this conference with Matteo Brera. Matteo?
I'm Matteo Brera. I work at York University as a postdoctoral fellow. So that's it.
And okay, so since all the speakers of this morning's panel are here, I will introduce Francesca Biliani, the moderator for the first panel. And then Francesca, I leave it to you to introduce the speakers. Francesca Biliani is senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, where she teaches contemporary Italian literature and culture. Her research focuses on the fascist period, censorship, literary journal, modernism, history of publishing, and intellectual history. She is the author of a monograph on the politics of translation in Italy between 1903 and 1943. She's the co-author of a monograph on architecture and the novel during the fascist regime, editor of a collection of essays on translations and censorship, and co-editor of a volume on the Italian Gothic and Fantastic, and of 3 special issues on scholarly journals. Her new monograph, Fascist Modernism in Italy, Arts and Regimes, will be out later on this year with Bloomsbury. So please, let's welcome Francesca Biliani. Thank you, Francesca, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. A pleasure for me. I'm always very pleased to be involved. We don't know each other personally, Elena, but I'm always very pleasure to be involved in it's a great pleasure to be involved in what Matteo organizes. So thank you very much. Since I do share his belief that punctuality is very important, I shall start with introducing the speakers. So we're following the same order that is the running order, and then I think we can leave questions at the end as we did previously. So our first speaker is Professor Marina Guglielmi. Marina Guglielmi is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Cagliari. And she's also a faculty member of a research center on multilingual and pluridisciplinary research based in Paris, Nanterre, Paris 10 and Nanterre. She's the editor and the founder of the journal Between, the journal of the Italian Association for the Theory and Comparative History of Literature, which has been very active nationally, internationally recently, this journal. And she, obviously, her research interests span quite widely. She's worked on literary translation, women's studies, literary representation of spaces, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. Recent publication include a monograph entitled Raccontare il manicomio, la macchina narrativa di Basaglia, fra parole e immagini, 2018, and a series of co-edited volumes with Giulio Iacoli, Piani sul mondo, le mappe nell'immaginazione letteraria, 2012, and with Claudia Cao, Sorelle e sorellanza nella letteratura e nelle arti, 2017. Today, Professor Guglielmi will be speaking to us, will be discussing with us Italian narratives of the asylum. Please, Professor Guglielmi.
Thank you, Francesca, for the presentation. Thank you, Elena and Matteo, for inviting me, for organizing this interesting conference. I'm trying to share my screen. Is it fine? Okay. Okay. So, 22 years ago in Italy, the law 180, which closed the asylums, was approved. The work of Franco Basaglia and the Group for the Radical Reform of Psychiatry thus achieved a revolutionary outcome. It actually took 20 years for psychiatric hospitals truly to close. In recent decades, the idea of psychiatric patient has changed a great deal. Some of the most important milestones are 1904, the first law on psychiatric internment states that anyone can be locked up against their will if they are considered dangerous or if they behave scandalously. Whoever enters an asylum loses all legal rights. 1961, Basaglia becomes director of the asylum of Gorizia, then he moves to Parma and Trieste. In those asylums, he experiments with the most important psychiatric reforms for the management of patients. 1968, the Mariotti law restores legal status to inmates. 1978, law Basaglia restores freedom, dignity, and autonomy to psychiatric patients. The sick return to being regarded as real people. No is said to asylum. It was a collective no, and this no changed the world. Writers, journalists, film directors, editors, and photographers have recounted this story extensively. The psychiatric novel was born, and it is still active today. First of all, I would like to make a distinction between the psychoanalytic and the psychiatric novel. The 20th century psychoanalytic novel is the narration of an individual journey that faces mental illnesses of various kinds. If the story also includes a narration of the treatment, two other elements intervene in the text: the professional figure, psychoanalyst or psychotherapist, and the place, the analytic setting. It is a narrative of an individual nature that generally concerns the therapeutic relationship between two subjects only, patient and therapist. Examples can be found obviously in Italo Svevo and Giuseppe Berto and so on. The psychiatric novel, on the other hand, is a narration of mental distress within a social path and a collective institution. Here the setting is the asylum or mental health center. Several elements are intertwined within the narrative of the treatment: the professional figures, the inmates, the location of the therapeutic community. It is a narrative of an individual character, whilst at the same time of a collective and relational type. This time, the relationship involves patients, therapists, and other subjects present within the community. The asylum is the setting of a disciplinary power, which has a decisive role in people's lives. In the disciplinary space, the human body enters a cog of power that searches it, disarticulates it, and reassembles it. Basaglia also stressed the importance of the relationship between space, power, and subject. Il manicomio, nato come difesa da parte dei sani contro la pazzia, sembra essere finalmente considerato il luogo dal quale il malato deve essere difeso e salvato. The study of the psychiatric novel is based on three key concepts and their interaction: the space of the asylum, the therapeutic relationship, and the psychiatric community. Examples from before Mario Tobino, before Basaglia, Mario Tobino's novels, and in recent time, Daniele Mencarelli, Ogni cosa chiede salvezza, winner of the Strega Giovani 2020 award. The psychiatric novel is subject to historical change. From the narration of the asylum made by Tobino in the years preceding Law 180 to the one made by Mencarelli today, the world has changed. Forced hospitalization no longer exists. Asylums have been replaced by mental health centers. Restraints have become illegal. No more straitjackets, patients tied to beds, cages, or electric shocks. The asylum institution has radically transformed, but has not disappeared. And today it is an active theme, both in narration and in the construction of the imaginary. How does the psychiatric patient living in the disciplinary space become the object or the subject of narration? The patient's interment can be narrated from the point of view of the patient or that of the psychiatrist. Mencarelli's autobiographical novel is an example of a contemporary psychiatric story set in a mental health center in Rome. It describes the experience of a teenager under TSO, a mandatory health treatment. In Italian psychiatric practice, the TSO is the legal form of forced short hospitalization motivated by a dangerous situation. The novel's narrator lives for a week with 6 other patients in an open psychiatric ward. The narrative from psychiatric's point of view has the different focus provided by those who combine a professional gaze and a testimonial role in one voice. The example I'm discussing today are Pepe dell'Acqua, tra parentesi, la vera storia di un'impensabile liberazione, and Paolo Milone, l'arte di legare le persone. Tra parentesi, the title is a quotation from Basaglia's statement. Mettiamo la malattia mentale tra parentesi e guardiamo le persone. Pepe dell'Acqua is a psychiatrist who worked with Basaglia at the Trieste Asylum. This piece has been staged in many Italian theaters before they closed for pandemic reason in March 2020. The theatrical scene is bare, only a red bench and 2 people sitting talking, Pepe dell'Acqua and Massimo Cirri. Dell'Acqua talks about his work in asylum from 1968 to 1980, the year of Basaglia's death. Memories are organized on 2 narrative levels, the human and professional relationship with Basaglia and the relationship with the patients. The psychiatric revolution has just begun. Psychiatrists have freed the sick from cages and beds, opened the wards, and introduced an open door system. There are the first assemblies in which patients, nurses, and doctors speak freely, all together, about life inside the asylum. All doctors work towards the goal set by Basaglia, to learn to observe and listen to patients. Nel paziente lo psichiatra non può più vedere solo un isolato oggetto di studio che gli si offre in una relazione alienante, ma un soggetto in cui può riconoscere la soggettività e la libertà. How does the psychiatric novel tell the truth? Which truth is it? In the psychoanalytic novel, there are 2 kinds of truth. What is said, the personal biographical truth, and how the truth is told through the dialogue or the report of the work with the therapist. In the psychiatric novel, there are more levels of truth. The biographical experience is accompanied by the way in which the story does not only mean talking about oneself, but talking about oneself in the space of a therapeutic community. In particular, in this play, Dell'Acqua constructs a narrative with his personal medical experience that is intertwined both with the narrative of the community living in the asylum and with his personal relationship with some patients. Patients appear in stock images projected into the background. In addition, patients are evoked in the author's memories, mentioned by name, and remembered for small episodes of their life in the asylum. Only one patient is represented on stage with the help of Massimo Cirri. The patient is evoked by the only gesture made during 2 hours of dialogue between the two seated men. This is a catatonic patient. Dell'Acqua is narrating his life as a student in the psychiatric department of the University of Naples in the 60s. His professor is Vito Longo, a psychiatrist who does not believe in Basaglia's theories. Professor Longo brings didactic material into the classroom. They are two schizophrenic and catatonic twin brothers. His method is to observe patients as if they were objects, to make their morphological description, to demonstrate the catatonic state that makes those two men rigid like two plaster statues. The professor raises the arm of one of them. On stage, Dell'Acqua raises Cirri's arm, which remains in that position until the end of the scene. The spectator, after a few minutes, begins to feel the discomfort of that arm that remains raised. With that small gesture, Dell'Acqua becomes the symbol of the Italian psychiatry on the stage, and Cirri personifies one of the thousands of patients who were treated as objects, not as people. Nobody tries to talk to these schizophrenic brothers. They are just teaching material. Cirri's arm is still raised. In the end, when Dell'Acqua lowers it after several minutes, we feel relieved, as if the psychiatric violence, which lasted for decades, was over at that moment. The reality of the life of the psychiatric patient can be put in perspective, so in two ways: reporting of violence suffered by inmates, or the narration of their personal stories. In the first approach, the patient is viewed like as an object. It is the same focusing technique as the photo books published in the 60s. In the second approach, the psychiatric relationship and dialogue restore subjectivity to the patient. The narrator, Dell'Acqua, addresses them as interlocutors. The second author, Paolo Milone, is also a psychiatrist who worked in mental health center. The 10 chapters contain a succession of fragments written in first person. The book expresses the search for the oral form to narrate the psychiatric reality. The narrative voice is addressed to a you who changes names, the patients Carmelo, Lucrezia, Luciano, or the psychiatrists and nurses, Marcello, Valerio, Gino. Also in Milone, the two narrative modes coexist. Patients are objects or subjects according to the perspective of vision. The relationship with reality in this case too is given by the author biography. The form of madness is instead rendered by the use of view. Patients are cited as if they were present and as if the psychiatrist was addressing them in the interview room. The style of the fragment, however, does not make it possible to talk too long. The reader, in a few lines, becomes aware of the patient, the pathology, and the end of his psychiatric story. Sometimes a happy ending, other times suicide. A great provocation underlines the whole narrative and is already in the title. Can binding people be an art? Instead of binding or sedating the mentally ill, Basaglia asks us not to objectify them, not to make them objects, but people. Quando in Medicina, yet Milone narrative of truth is based on the need to resolve sudden violence and dangerous cases. His perspective is a reinterpretation of what was bound by Basaglia revolution. Quando in medicina si fa un passo avanti, nessuno demonizza i vecchi metodi, nessuno accusa chi li praticava. Non è così in psichiatria. Qui si bonifica il presente mettendo il male nel passato. Per questo io voglio parlare del legare le persone. Milone claims the act of binding people is to defend them from themselves, to prevent them from harming themselves. The author claims it is a necessary practice of psychiatry when there is no time to wait for a dialogue. Non è cattivo chi lega, legare è faticoso, è cattivo chi abbandona il paziente. In Dell'Acqua, the great theme truth is the patient as the subject of a relationship. In Milone, the other truth theme is restraint as a form of protection of the patient from himself. 42 years after Law 180, two modalities of the psychiatric novel coexist in the Italian panorama today. Both address the social question of the asylum, both recount the different ways of treatment, but above all, they tell the story of men, women, and children that the institution had locked up and made invisible to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this thoughtful and thought-provoking paper. I think there'll be lots of questions at the end. I mean, I've got a few, but I'll spare them for the end. So our next speaker is Alessandra Montalbano, who is assistant professor of Italian at the University of Alabama. And she has completed her PhD at New York University and her first degree, la laurea, at the University in philosophy at the University of Verona. She's published, and she's about to be published, on a variety of issues and topics, right, spanning victim-centered narratives of terrorism, kidnapping victims' experience of captivity, and the underworld of the Italian Republic. That's something that probably you won't exhaust very quickly. Other publications have explored issue links to the representation of the body, language, gender, life writing in the works of Pasolini, Merleau-Ponty, Dacia Maraini, as well as Italian contemporary feminism. She is currently work on a book on the phenomenon of ransom kidnapping in Italy, which I suspect has informed today's paper, which is entitled The Trauma of Captivity in Ransom Kidnapping. Thank you very much, Alessandra. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you, Elena and Matteo, for organizing this conference. And yes, let's start. So I'm going to share my screen, and can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so when we think about kidnapping in Italy, the reaction that comes to mind is that of the president of Christian Democrats, Aldo Moro, kidnapped and murdered in 1978 by the terrorist group Red Brigades. Yet in the same year, 43 private lesser-known citizens were kidnapped for ransom by criminal organizations identified under the general name of Anonymous Sequestri. In 1977, before Moro's abduction, the number of ransom kidnappings reached its peak, 75 in 1 year. Political kidnapping was a phenomenon predominantly linked to the BR, who between 1972 and 1981 abducted symbolic public figures in order to both destabilize democratic institutions, the economic elite, and the media, and to attack the heart of the state. This terrorist group was responsible for 26 abductions in total. In the same period, 1975 and 1984, the Anonymous Sequestri abducted 489 people. That is 70% of the ransom kidnapping victims in the history of the Italian Republic. If during the Anni di Piombo, the Italian state was under the attack of political terrorism, Italian civil society was also threatened by terrifying crimes whose roots were, so by terrifying crimes whose roots were Sardinia banditry, Cosa Nostra, and the 'Ndrangheta. Though most widespread between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s, these crimes also destabilized the country before and after these decades. Indeed, between the late 1960s and the late 1990s, nearly 700 people were abducted for ransom in Italy. Among the victims of ransom kidnapping, some decided to write and publish the accounts of their ordeals, which allows us to look at the kidnapping phenomenon from the perspective of the abducted. Adopting the lens of their testimony does not mean using these texts as documents, facts, or evidence. The accounts of the kidnapped are not archival materials, and their narratives cannot explain the intentionality and circumstances behind the crime. But this is not the right question to ask the abducted, given that they are not the architects of their abductions. On the contrary, the kidnapping is for them an unexpected event that erupts in their lives and interrupts the flow of time. What we shall instead recognize and investigate is the agencies of the victim's account. Why did they decide to write their books? What granted them the authority to do so? Is giving account of their traumatic experience a political action? What I want to explore with you today is how the victim's memoir testifies to the isolation of captivity as a traumatized loneliness that forced the hostage to dangerously bond with their persecutors in order to survive. I argue that these texts testify to the trauma of captivity and ransom kidnapping to overcome these powerful bonds and to demand justice from the state. Before starting our analysis, though, let me introduce to you the three kidnapped victims who are the author of the memoirs we're going to read together. Among the victims of the 70s crime wave, Luigi Rossi di Montelera wrote his memoir, Racconto di un sequestro. He was kidnapped in Piemonte, and after 4 hard months of captivity, spent practically buried alive in 2 different restricted cells, the police freed him. Rossi belonged to a very well-known family, owners of the famous liquor brand Martini & Rossi. His kidnapping was the second in northern Italy committed by Cosa Nostra. In November 1975, Carla Ovazza was captured in Turin and spent 35 days in what she called a clandestine prison. Her hiding place was an extremely restricted space which her abductors built inside a farmstead. Her kidnapping was one of the first organized by members of the 'Ndrangheta settled in Piemonte. And this is her memoir, 5 ciliegie rosse, una notte lunga 35 giorni. In November 1981, 2 masked men captured Donatella Teresi Mosca outside of Florence. Her captivity was terribly hard and lasted 54 days, which she spent hidden in a hole in the ground in a Tuscan forest. Tesi's persecutors were not professional abductors. They were 2 criminals who came into contact in prison with Sardinian bandits sentenced for ransom kidnapping. Once outside, they decided to become kidnappers as well. And this is her memoir, Sindrome da Sequestro. Okay, so the first noteworthy element of the kidnapping victim's memoir is that it is exclusively written after the abducted are released. While hostages, the kidnapped, are not allowed to either write or read. We cannot therefore frame these texts as prison writings or diaries, even if they share some elements with those 2 genres, such as the pressure of a totalizing authority under which the imprisoned self writes, and in certain cases, a chronological reconstruction of time. However, being a prisoner and being a hostage are not the same things. We find an illuminating distinction between these 2 conditions in Guy Delisle's graphic memoir, Hostage, published in 2017, in which a Canadian cartoonist illustrates and recounts in the first person the ransom kidnapping of Christophe André, a French administrator for Doctors Without Borders, abducted in 1977 by Chechens in the Caucasus. 2 weeks in his capture, André is lying on a mattress on the ground in an empty and dark room, his wrist handcuffed to a radiator. Being a hostage is worse than being in prison. In prison, at least you know why you are locked up. There is a reason. Whether it's right or wrong, at least there is a reason. But being a hostage is just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. In prison, you know you will get when you'll get out, the exact date. You can count down the days you've got left to go. Here, all I can do is count the days that have passed without knowing when it'll be over. Delille places these words in a series of cartoons that move the reader's eyes from the ostrich's body to a corner in the ceiling that he's staring at, to a light bulb that is always off, back to his body, and finally to a door whose handle's click-clack interrupts his thoughts. The memoirs of the kidnapped, even without Delille's oppressive and detailed monochromatic cartoons, give the reader the same claustrophobic sensation of being closed inside a hiding place where nothing happened and time does not pass. For more than 400 pages, Delille envisioned the hostage's timeless condition by illustrating the restrictive spaces, his minimum movements, and especially his never-ending thoughts. The narrative of the kidnapping memoirs put us in the mind of the abducted as well. Any small noise or word that the hostage perceive or a meal that they receive is a way out of from their imagination that brings both them and us back to the emptiness of their captivity. The reader endures with the victims the impossibility of projecting oneself into the future that comes from waiting without knowing when release will, and if the release will take place. Nevertheless, unlike André, the hostages of Italian ransom kidnapping cannot define their condition as bad luck, unless we consider living in Italy between the late 96 and the late 1990s as being in a wrong place, wrong time. This is to say that being hostages of abduction in Italy has never been an accidental condition. It was instead a consequence of a systematic criminal phenomenon that for years blackmailed the citizens of the country. One could respond that these were only privileged citizens who for the first time believed the socioeconomic reality of the peninsula and therefore its history. However, the approach that looks at ransom kidnappings as a phenomenon linked to social class struggle does not take under consideration the fact that the victims were not always affluent and that behind the abductions were criminal organizations. Conversely, in their accounts, the abducted speak out as individuals of a state in which this crime was able to succeed. If in relation to their kidnappers, the hostages, like André, find no reason that gives sense to their condition, money, in fact, just objectifies them, in relation to the state, the hostages demand justice. With their stories, the kidnapped give voice to all the victims of abduction in Italy, and the memory of their personal experience reaches the level of a social political testimony. Another central element of the kidnapping memoir, absent in the book Hostage, is the relationship the abducted developed with their warders. Unable to understand the language of his kidnapper, André wasn't exposed to the hostage, to what the hostage depict as the most devastating aspect of their captivity. The kidnapped are alone while enduring their abduction. Psychiatrists recognize that, unlike in prison or concentration camps, the victims of abduction develop a personal relationship with their enemies due to the loneliness of their experience. The isolation of captivity and the negotiation with the external world are two distinctive conditions of ransom kidnapping that create a very unique bond between prisoner and persecutors. They both want the same thing, for the captivity to end as a result of the hostages' families' collaboration, but they are inside an imbalanced and violent relationship in which the victim occupies an extremely psychologically and bodily vulnerable position. What we will analyze is how the total isolation of the kidnapped, both communicative and perceptual, brings the victim to emotionally depend on their persecutors in order to survive. At an emotional level, the complete isolation of captivity is for the kidnapped an absolute loneliness that, as a second imprisonment, keeps them trapped in and exposed to what we can call the inner front of their abduction, that is, its psychological front. After the initial trauma of being suddenly captured, the kidnapped live the chain of traumatic events that kidnapping imposes: forced deprivation of liberty, physical abuse, change of hiding places, being chained, being threatened with death and mutilation, humiliation, and sensorial deprivation with a traumatized self, meaning that they endure captivity with a disorganized system of self-defense and with a feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. Seen from the traumatic perspective, the lack of communication with the outside world is for the captor a complete lack of external holds that leave them alone inside and makes them feel as though their ego is on the edge of a cliff. In his memoir, Luigi Rossi di Montelera vividly described this feeling. Una volta, anni fa, mentre scalavo una delle torri del Sella nelle Dolomiti, mi trovai incordato in parete. Non riuscivo più ad andare né avanti né indietro e mi tenevo ad appigli veramente minimi. Dopo un po' di tentativi mi sentii lentamente venir meno le forze, mollai la presa e precipitai. Mi tenne la corda. La sensazione che provavo ora era un po' dello stesso genere, sentire che le forze, le difese vengono meno, che non c'è nulla da fare, nessun appiglio da aggrapparsi e ci si sente piombare nel vuoto, nella disperazione, con un senso di angoscia e di sgomento. Ma mentre precipitando in montagna c'era la corda che mi avrebbe trattenuto, qui non c'era nessuna corda, ero solo con me stesso e solo in me potevo trovare le forze per vincere, o meglio per non morire. Among the experiences he had in his life, that of falling while mountain climbing is for Rossi the most appropriate image to envision his traumatized ego. His is not just a metaphor, but rather a physical sensation he had in the past, of which the present collapse of his system of self-defense reminds him. Unlike in the mountains, though, Rossi is here completely alone and therefore without anything that can save him from falling. What I call the inner front of kidnapping is exactly the internal downfall that the hostages seek to resist with all their strength. It is in this emotional context that the relationship with their warders becomes for the kidnapped necessary. The psychiatrist Nerede Rudas, Giampaolo Pintore, and Irene Mascia give an enlightened definition of the relationship hostage-warder, calling it solitudine con il nemico. The victims prefer to share their loneliness with the bandit rather than remain by themselves. The relationship with their warder is in fact a way to remove what Rossi calls the spectrum of this loneliness, which, without a dialogue, is lived by the victim as a nightmare with open eyes. In other words, remaining alone means for the kidnapped to live their captivity at the mercy of their unconscious. As Judy Herman underlies in the Trauma and Recovery, prisoners deprived of any possible connection with peers not only depend on their abductors for survival abilities, but they also develop, and I quote, an emotional dependence upon their captors. In his study, Victim Responsive to Terror, Marty Simmons considered this type of attachment a traumatic psychological infantilism, which, and I quote, compels victims to cling to the very person who is endangering their lives. The consequence of this attachment is the identification of the victims with their persecutors, which psychiatrists define as Stockholm Syndrome. According to Herman, this bond explains the incomprehensible behavior of some hostages who, after their release, defend their persecutors, visit them in prison, and even raise money for their defense, which is something that happened in Italy as well. What interests our analysis is the link between trauma and language that the memoirs of the kidnapped, unlike psychiatrist literature, illuminate. Trauma has a destructive consequence on the hostage's inner speech, meaning that it is extremely hard for them to be present through an inner narration. Completely isolated, without the dialogue with their persecutors, the hostage itself has no mediations, and so it is submerged by its traumatized condition. Perché il buio e la solitudine mi erano diventati intollerabili, perché avevo bisogno di parlare, di esprimere la mia angoscia a un altro essere, ad altro essere, nemico o amico che fosse, purché mi ascoltasse e mi confortasse rompendo un silenzio insopportabile e allontanando con le sue parole tutte le allucinazioni della notte. Allora lo pregavo di restare sempre accanto a me, perché quell'isolamento mi avrebbe fatto impazzire. Lacking the perception of external words means for Tesi to be close inside her inner language, the language of an inner disaster, through which she can no longer narrate herself, but in which she rather finds herself prey to hallucinations. By destroying the possibility of mediating their self through an inner speech, and therefore of being present through an inner linguistic self-reflexivity, trauma internally excludes the victim from language. In such a condition, the voice of the warders becomes the only space available for self-reflexivity, and so the only hold they have to be present without precipitating. In other words, to perceive the perpetrator voices is for the kidnapped a harbor. that saves them from their most dangerous kidnappers, their traumatized self. But it is exactly this need for a dialogue that puts the victim in the condition of being completely exposed to the power of their kidnappers, who, taking advantage of their vulnerability, brainwash their hostages. In their testimonies, in fact, the kidnapped declared that during their captivity, one of the most intolerable contradictions was listening to the abductors who, accusing their family, tried to make them think that everyone had abandoned them, yet still preferred their company to loneliness. If on the one hand, the victim needs to perceive the spoken language of the warders, on the other hand, that spoken language sadistically denies and destroys the word and self. These accounts nevertheless create in the victims a split between their body and their self. The latter becomes narrated by the perpetrators and therefore disembodied. This is to say that the language through which the hostage envisioned their captivity and their self as the perceptual frame and the viewpoint of the kidnappers. Non provo nessun risentimento per i miei carcerieri, sarà la conseguenza delle conversazioni che abbiamo avuto. In fondo, a parte le botte del viaggio e l'operazione cera alle orecchie, a parte le condizioni igieniche quasi insopportabili e il freddo intenso, mi hanno trattata meno peggio di quello che temevo. Apparentemente mi tengono al corrente di tutto e anzi direi che cercano di incoraggiarmi e non di terrorizzarmi. Forse sono veramente delle vittime come mi hanno raccontato. For the reader, the most disturbing aspect of the victims' accounts is the gap between what their words make visible of their ordeal and the way in which, from inside their captivity, they perceive it. Carlo Vazza is here recounting the third day of her imprisonment, and as we can see, even after a number of traumatic events, she cannot hate the perpetrators. On the contrary, she feels pity for them. Vazza's feeling is not linked to the lack of severity in what she suffered up to this moment of her captivity, as she tells herself, but rather to her inability to defend herself. Traumatized and alone, she frames her condition and her kidnappers through the stories they tell her. The victim's memoir testified to the warder's narratives as a vehicle that brings them to develop what psychiatrists define as traumatic bond or Stockholm syndrome. Questo dialogo che avevo stabilito con lui mi sembrava allora una cosa positiva, perché mi toglieva dalla solitudine che era ciò che temevo di più, ma poi invece è risultato un fatto negativo. Infatti, così facendo, lui si impadroniva sempre più della mia personalità. Mentre io gli facevo intuire tanti lati del mio carattere, lui di se stesso parlava molto, ma ne falsava completamente la realtà. Tutti questi discorsi me li faceva mostrandosi ai miei occhi migliori di quello che era, per impietosirmi e commuovermi. Only after her imprisonment, Tesi recognizes the danger of her warder's spoken language, with which he had portrayed himself as he wished and made her feel what he wanted. Unaware of her condition during captivity, she is exposed to the violent and distressing words through which her warder kidnaps herself. If the hiding places hide the body of the kidnapped, the language of kidnapping hides their self. Traumatized and immersed in the only narration allowed, the kidnapped find themselves captured in what in his memoir, Il mio sequestro, Giuseppe Sonfiantini, abducted in 1997 by Sardinian bandits in Tuscany, defines as lingua senza scampo del banditismo. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, and this angle on something that we don't tend to think about all the time when we're thinking about kidnapping, and that's very interesting. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end, and let's move on to, we're on perfect, Matteo, we're keeping to time.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. So our third speaker is Giorgia Bordoni, who is a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but this is a second PhD. She's trained as a philosopher who specialized in Italian, French, and German moral philosophy, politics, and aesthetics. And she completed her first PhD at the Italian Institute of Human Science that is between Florence and Naples. She is also an active translator of philosophical works by Derrida, for example, and she is currently working on the the representation of the Nazi lager as a machine in Primo Levi's writing. But by all means, this is not her only interest. More broadly, she's interested in intersection between violence, war, death, machineries, and writing in the Italian 20th century. And today she will give us a paper entitled The Third Zone of Captivity, the Impossibility of Dying in Primo Levi's and Morselli's Writings. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for inviting me to this beautiful conference. And so thank you for listen to me, to my contribution. So my aim today is to focus on the impossibility of dying as a peculiar kind of captivity of body and mind represented in Primo Levi's testimony novel Se questo è un uomo and in Guido Morselli's dystopian novel Dissipatio HG. I will illustrate how both literary scenarios show such a situation of captivity for the characters involved in the narrative plot, the one of being prisoner in the third zone between life and death, a neighboring space in which the dissolution of human essence takes the form of a forced survival between the remaining human and the non-being human anymore. By interplaying the philosophical reflection of Arendt, Agamben, and Nancy on mortality as a fundamental experience making human the human being, I explored the captivity based on an interruption of mortality in Levi's and Morselli's literature. My contribution actually addresses the being in between of literary characters who are stuck in an horrific space of time in which the impossible experience of oneself and of the other forbids a collective experience of the world. In this space happens a specific apocalypse of humanity, the one where humans are stuck inside the machinery of eternal present with no human death possibility, and where they look like mechanic gears in Levi or ex-human in dissolution in Morselli. In my angle, the key concept to understand the meaning of such a third zone of captivity created by the impossibility of experiencing death in Primo Levi's literature is the one of machine, and actually of grigia macchina. Levi's novel Se questo è un uomo points the machine out as a crucial structure of the Nazi camp and as what the being between life and death is based on. The machine triggers a dissolution that turns humans into pieces, parts, gears. I quote from Levi: quando questa musica suona, noi sappiamo che i compagni fuori nella nebbia partono in marcia come automi. Le loro anime sono morte e la musica li sospinge, come il vento le foglie secche, e si sostituisce alla loro volontà. Non c'è più volontà. Ogni pulsazione diventa un passo, ogni contrazione riflessa dei muscoli sfatti. Sono 10.000 e sono una sola grigia macchina. Sono esattamente determinati. Non pensano e non vogliono, camminano. In the Nazi machine nulla è vivo se non macchine e schiavi, e più quelle di questi, Levi said. The prisoner starts an endless path of annihilation in the running machine, and this particular metamorphosis is a dissolution of bodies and minds. They become actually automatons, larvae, puppets. The philosopher Hannah Arendt states that Nazi totalitarianism has fabricated the highest form of evil, the ontological crime of killing the human being uniqueness. Arendt very sharply states that the horror in the extermination camps can never be embraced by the imagination for the very reason that it stands outside of life and death. This quote. Arendt's words are illuminating to approach the mechanism of the lager illustrated in Primo Levi's literature, namely the grigia macchina that triggers the transformation of humans into living dead or walking corpse. The Nazi machine does not just achieve the simple mass production of corpses, but, I quote from Adriana Cavarero, it prolongs annihilation of those who, albeit still alive, are already dead, because in them the essential boundary between living and dying has been erased. The uniqueness of every human being, and hence the necessarily unique dimension of a life that concludes with death, has been annihilated. In other words, the Nazi machine transforms unique human beings into a mass of superfluous beings whose murder is impersonal, say Arendt. Primo Levi described, in fact, prisoners in the Nazi machine of annihilation as miserable and sordid puppets, having no human anymore, According to Arendt, they are ghastly marionettes with human faces. Again, Adriana Cavarero explained that these ghastly marionettes are indeed perverted with respect to the natural spontaneity that is rooted in the uniqueness of every human being, that are the result of a systematic destruction of the human being, that dismembers the singularity of individual on which are founded all human relationships. Arendt accuses Nazi machine of having executed an unprecedented attack on the ontological dignity of the singular being in favor of the absolutization of the one. So this one is, in my view, the huge grigia macchina of the Nazi camp that Primo Levi's novel reveals to the reader. In Arendt's words, it is a regime that strives not toward despotic rule over human, but toward a system in which humans are superfluous. And again, in Levi's word, allora, per la prima volta, ci siamo accorti che la nostra lingua manca di parole per esprimere questa offesa, la demolition di un uomo. The main figure embodying the effect of the Nazi devastation of uniqueness in humanity, and indeed the most successful, in a way, and awful production of the grigia macchina process, is what Levi calls the drone, the musulmano, the uomo in dissolvimento. The musulmano is the evidence of the extreme horror fabricated by the grigia macchina. I quote from Levi. I sommersi, il nervo del campo, loro la massa anonima, continuamente rinnovata e sempre identica, dei non uomini che marciano e faticano in silenzio, spenta la loro scintilla divina, già troppo vuoti per soffrire veramente. Si esita a chiamare morte la loro morte, davanti a cui essi non temono, perché sono troppo stanchi per comprenderla. According to Giorgio Agamben, il musulmano, I quote, segnava in qualche modo la mobile soglia in cui l'uomo trapassava il non uomo. The musulmano is actually the walking corpse, the invulnerable living death, the automaton paralyzed in the unbridgeable gap between life and death. I quote from Agamben, né la vita né la morte, ma la produzione di una sofferenza modulabile e virtualmente infinita costituisce la prestazione decisiva del biopotere del nostro tempo. Primo Levi's writing shows the musulmano as a border figure, actually because in the camp the dignity of death has been definitely denied. Again, Agamben, I quote, ad Auschwitz non si moriva, venivano prodotti cadaveri, cadaveri senza morte, non uomini il cui decesso è svilito a produzione in serie. Following once again Agamben reasoning, il musulmano è il non uomo che si presenta ostinatamente come uomo e l'umano che è impossibile sceverare dall'inumano. Lui è il motore interno del campo, inteso come macchina biopolitica, biopolitical machine. Once Agamben defines terzo regno, third realm, between human and non-human, such a space where the musulmano is as ultimate manifestation of the larger dehumanization process, should actually be deemed, in my view, as a kind of space of time. More precisely, I mean that his Levi novel, the specific third zone of captivity between life and death, produced by the grigia macchina, definitely affects the perception of existential temporality for humans. Accordingly, because of such a dysfunction in temporality era stakes, the human being turned in not human. I quote from Levi. Eccomi dunque sul fondo. A dare un colpo di spugna al passato e al futuro si impara presto, se il bisogno preme. Spingo vagoni, lavoro di pala, mi fiacco alla pioggia, tremo al vento. Già il mio stesso corpo non è più il mio. From the beginning of Levi's novels, human feeling of the past and of the future, and therefore the whole human representation of lifetime, namely the co-implication between the memory of the past, the planning of the present toward the future, and the expectation, prefiguration of dying, immediately becomes impossible. I quote again from Levi. Non pareva possibile che veramente esistesse un mondo e un tempo, se non il nostro mondo di fango e il nostro tempo sterile e stagnante, a cui eravamo ormai incapaci di immaginare una fine. Per gli uomini vivi, le unità di tempo hanno sempre un valore, il quale è tanto maggiore quanto più elevate sono le risorse interne di chi le percorre. Ma per noi ore, giorni, mesi si riversavano torpidi dal futuro nel passato, sempre troppo lenti, materia vile e superflua, di cui cercavamo di disfarci al più presto. Conchiuso il tempo in cui i giorni si inseguivano vivaci, preziosi e irreparabili, il futuro ci stava davanti, grigio e inarticolato, come una barriera invincibile. Per noi la storia si era fermata. Fine della citazione. In this passage, the narrator Primo brings the dysfunctional temporality of Lager inmates up and an existential status in which not only the Musulmano, but every captive, every prisoner is locked inside. Levi confesses in the last pages of his novel that I personaggi di queste pagine non sono uomini. So, the laggard time looks like an eternal mechanic present. Said Levi, lo sappiamo che domani sarà come oggi. In the Nazi camp, the time is over, and the human feeling of life, temporality too. The situation in lager for the captives that Levi defines the folla dei semivivi looks like an useless and exhausting waiting for nothing. I quote from Levi. Noi non più vivi, noi già per metà dementi nella squallida attesa del niente. This peculiar status is an uncanny infinitive survival between life and death, human and not human. I quote, non sono più abbastanza vivo per sapermi sopprimere. Per noi non è previsto un termine. Il lager altro non è che il genere di esistenza a noi assegnata, senza limiti di tempo. What happens so in Guido Morselli, dystopian novel? At the beginning of Guido Morselli's dystopian novel, Dissipatio HG, the narrator wanted to get away from the human war by trying suicide. Despite of the careful preparation, his plan fails and he remains alive. The day after the attempted suicide, the narrator has to deal with an incredible event, the apocalyptic miracolo orrendo of the disappearance of every human being on heart. In such a dissolution, dissipatio, he realized that the whole humanity has vanished into nothingness, nebulized, without trace, and he was left behind, alive and alone. I quote from Morselli. Rimane ciò che pur essendo corporeo non era organico. Rimane anche quello che è organico e vivente, ma non umano. The dissipatio, dissolution, throws the narrating subject into an existential and emotive condition of bewilderment and terror. He starts living the new experience of wondering if he can still consider himself as a human being or not, given the condition of being the only survivor in a world without anyone. Precisely by reflecting on the new situation of his status after the dissipatio, the only human character of the novel asks himself why, in such an evaporation and sublimatio of humanity, he has been spared. He stays in the third zone, so a no man's land between life and death. I quote from Morselli. L'ignoto mi è addosso e io sono solo, senza scampo, non ho aiuto, non ho consiglio. Una creatura umana non è fatta per trovarsi a questo. È la mia sola certezza. Questo è un errore, una negligenza inaudita, che un unico essere umano sia stato lasciato indietro, l'ultimo degli uomini. Mi è chiaro che sono in superstite, questo sì, è indubbiamente assurdo, ingiusto, grottesco. Fatemi morire. Nel bene o nel male li devo raggiungere. Non ero diverso da loro, mi assomigliavano tutti, ignoranza e superbia inclusa. End of quotation. In this situation of collective dissolution, the narrator is not even capable of committing suicide anymore, his previous willing. I quote, non avendo destinatari, non posso più uccidermi. Per prima cosa bisognerebbe risolvere la questione se e fino a che punto io sia ancora vivo, cioè soggetto, oggetto possibile di suicidio. End of quotation. The evaporation of humanity, as for the narrator's survivor, also the effect of the disappearance of temporality. And this condition starts a slow and progressive loss of humanity, a dissolution which makes him an ex-human. I quote, il mio individuo è in liquidazione, il mio individuo psichico, sono l'ex uomo. Quello che mi pare sicuro è che io, come uomo, sono finito. Per me che lo guardo da un'orbita di parcheggio, questo è la permanenza nel provvisorio, la dilatazione estrema dell'attimo e in termini empirici questo vuol dire tempo eterno, stato di differibilità assoluta. Sono ex uomo davvero, uscito dalla mia pelle. End of quotation from Morselli. So in such a condition of absolute loneliness, the dissipatio happens to the narrator in a very peculiar way, namely turning him into a shadow of himself, an automaton, an ex-human. This absolute suspension between life and death, and above all the impossibility to die, triggers in the narrator survivor a process of dissipatio simultaneously equivalent and opposite to the one that physically affected other human beings. It is an alteration of his humanity, a dehumanization path. So Levi and Morselli novels meet each other by virtue of the impossibility of experience dying represented in their literary scenarios. What they claim is that is the condition of possibility, so to speak, the a priori, that presides the impossibility of experiencing death, is activated precisely by being in a situation in which the community of humans is missing. It happens that both novel, it happens in both novel, or because of a lack of humanity in a community, Levi, or because it's not possible to be part of human community anymore, Morselli. Each novel links in its own way the impossibility for the human individual to experience dying with the impossibility of being with the other human being. In Levi's novel, the Nazi camp is illustrated as a kind of community of human gears that runs like a machine, and in a way that puts prisoners together without giving them the chance to really be together. Indeed, the Nazi grigia macchina implicates the prisoners in its dehumanization process, which working is directly proportional to the level of alienation of them as human gears. The Nazi mechanic communities is an industrious one, so to speak, actually because it is made of isolated human gears forcibly involved in the operation of the device. Becoming automata means becoming immortal like a machine, so that the experience of being aware about dying is impossible. We can deduce that such of communities is an operative community, but is not a community at all, but just an agglomeration of pieces, gear of the annihilation machine. What's happened instead in Morselli's novel is that the possibility of being in a space inhabited by humans is vanished due to the dissipatio. Consequently, the experiencing of dying becomes impossible actually because of the disappearance of the other. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy proposes a reflection on community that seems to me to be illuminating for understanding the connection between community and the human experience of dying, exhibited in a novel of Levi and Morselli. Along a path strongly marked by the concept of être avec, being with, Nancy conceived the community not as a common being, but as the being in common of an existence coinciding with an exposure to otherness. There is therefore in the elaboration of this philosopher a strong link between community and coexistence. In this work, Être singulier pluriel, being singular plural, Nancy wrote, that which exists, whatever it is coexistence. The co-implication of existing is the partitioning of the word. A word is nothing external to existence. It is not an extrinsic addition of other existences. A word is the coexistence that disposes them together. In other words, community is a being in common, being with one another or being together. I am I only if I can say we. Community is a participation in existence. The most meaningful part of the word communities is in fact the Latin co, which means being with, co-presence, the space of sharing. That is the ontological root for the foundation of the being that from the beginning of the human existence precede the individual. From Être singulier pluriel, Nancy wrote, avec est le premier trait de l'être. With is the first trait of being. By starting from the idea of the incompleteness of human being as an individual, Jean-Luc Nancy defines the community as what state between the individual and the world, on level of sharing. In his former work, la communauté des œuvrés, the inoperative community, Nancy pointed out actually the bond between community, coexistence, and the experience of dying. His idea is that the experience of dying is the main condition for the sharing of the world and consequently for the existence of the community. It is above all the consciousness about that, namely the capacity for humans to feel and understand their finitude and mortality, that connects humans. But death, if it is constitutive for the community, it is also its frontier, its boundary. In fact, only a living being who is able to experience the feeling of loss and death is still part of the community. Jean-Luc Nancy indicates that the human beings can only exist outside of themselves, and therefore in the opening to the world that allows communication, or rather sharing, and the community itself. The experience of dying is the very condition of possibility for the existence of a shared space, actually because it wouldn't lead to a violent totalization, to a violent operative community, as happened in the history of totalitarianism in 20th century. According to Nancy, the community has to be inoperative, not operative, which means that it should not operate the building of any exclusive community of individual, because in this way the community would be potentially violent against who is outside of it, the different one, the other. Nancy's reflection on community, coexistence, and mortality brings an enlightening perspective to approach the third zone of captivity I try to show in my contribution today by underlining it as a dehumanization status in both Levi and Morselli literary scenarios. These two novels, indeed, show the double relation of presupposition between two conditions of the coexistence, both primary and essential. The mortality and the community are mutually the condition one of each other. What is at stake in Levi's novel is the impossibility to be in community, given the impossibility to experience mortality and so the living. What's happened in Morselli's novel is, in other way, the other side of the moon, the impossibility to experience mortality and so the living because of the impossibility to be in community. So there is no coexistence without community and mortality. Thank you so much for attention.
Thank you very much, Georgia, for this kind of philosophical reading of these novels and sort of widening, in a sense, the scope of what we're trying to sort of work through. So I think we can open the floor to questions. If you have any questions, we got about 20 minutes. I won't abuse my position as chair and start with the questions, but please feel free. I can ask the questions last. Don't be shy. Okay, if you don't, I'll start. I'll start because I have a question for Marina. I was wondering about the sort of these novels and of course the way in which Basaglia's theories are represented, if you like. But I was Basaglia, of course, being a fairly controversial, being controversial himself, and I think within the kind of psychiatric community at the time. I don't think, and later, I don't think that his theories were necessarily always accepted, even within more enlightened, if you like, not just reactionary sides of a sort of kind of psychiatric community. I was wondering whether there are novels which address the sort of polemic or controversy around Basaglia, also, or if that's it's been subject to sort of kind of narrativization. So Basaglia, yes, but is there also the sort of polemic and controversial side of his work that has been somehow turned into fiction or questioned through fiction?
Okay.
I think we can, sorry, can we take questions in Italian and English as you prefer, or? So I think we can speak the language we feel more comfortable in answering.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Va bene, allora forse rispondo in italiano se posso farlo. Grazie Francesca della domanda. Allora, la produzione narrativa opposta, diciamo, antagonista alla posizione di Basaglia, se ho ben capito la tua domanda, in realtà è rappresentata oggi più che mai da questo esempio di Milone che vi ho portato come uno dei pochissimi casi. In realtà dagli anni 70 nasce questa grande rappresentazione, questa grande narrazione manicomiale che è pro-basagliana. La polemica non si svolge in ambito narrativo, si svolge sui giornali, su documentari, posizioni politiche alternative, cioè grandissima produzione di immaginario in ambito visivo, visuale, che va pro o contro Basaglia. In ambito narrativo è molto più limitata, nel senso che ci sono molte testimonianze di pazienti, ex pazienti, medici, intellettuali che si interessano a questo, ma in genere sono a favore della rivoluzione basagliana, chiamiamola così. La grande polemica è quella con Mario Tobino, che racconta i manicomi dal suo punto di vista ponendosi contro Basaglia. In fondo Tobino scrive fino agli anni '80, appunto fa una polemica sui giornali con Basaglia, insomma se ne parla molto, e lui sostiene invece una posizione assolutamente contraria, affermando che le nuove camicie di forza sono gli psicofarmaci e che quindi i manicomi in realtà sono un buon posto dove rimanere, dove tenere i pazienti. Quindi il più grande rappresentante di quello che tu dici è stato Tobino, e oggi è in fondo Milone, che però non ha mai lavorato con Basaglia, è più giovane, insomma parla di altre esperienze, però rivendica una forma, se vuoi, più simile a quella di Tobino. Infatti c'è un dibattito in questo momento molto acceso sul suo libro.
Sì, più che altro mi riferivo al fatto che ovviamente quando ci sono queste grandi rivoluzioni, ovvio chi era con Basaglia e chi non era con Basaglia, ma mi chiedevo se c'erano delle persone che nonostante fossero degli psichiatri illuminati e comunque non accettavano il tipo di psichiatria punitiva, ci fossero delle posizioni diciamo a cavallo, nel senso sì, accetto, però non totalmente. Quelle che è stato. Ecco, mi chiedevo semplicemente se ci fosse stata questo, perché si tende sempre a polarizzarlo, la sfera a metà, cioè sì va bene, però fino a un certo punto, senza essere contrario. Me lo chiedevo così.
Sì, sì, ci sono state tutte le possibilità di risposta a Basaglia, non è stata una voce univoca assolutamente, insomma lo dimostra il fatto che poi ci siano voluti tanti anni per chiudere realmente i manicomi nonostante la legge, ci siano state molte opposizioni, sì sì, non è stato assolutamente un discorso a senso unico, e c'è tantissimo materiale in proposito. Mi fermo perché potrei parlare settimane di questo, quindi preferisco fermarmi.
Va bene. Are there other questions?
C'è Antonio Calcagno.
Oddio, sì, sorry.
Sorry.
I
Thanks so much.
couldn't see the end. Please.
That's okay. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed all the 3 talks today. They were all very illuminating and so rich. So I really appreciate listening to the discourses and learning much about the different aspects that were discussed. My question is for Alessandra Montalbano. And I was really gripped by this whole notion of the solitude with the enemy, la solitudine col nemico. And I was wondering, are there other resources? So, you know, you talked about the constraints, the physical, material constraints and the horrible situations that people found themselves in. And I'm wondering whether in the literature that you discussed, whether there's also the use of other faculties of the mind, for example, imagination or inner dialogue or a kind of memory, these kind of tools to maybe perhaps cope with the the loneliness. So in a way, you create another self, a kind of a split that is, provides some kind of defense. I don't know if the authors talk about that kind of experience. I was curious, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Antonio, for your great questions. And yes, they do, and they do in a different way. I mean, the dialogue with the warders is one, like the immediate things that they need to do, and it's more, it's even more perception than an emotional. Sometimes the emotion is not toward them. The emotion is what is going on in their traumatized ego, and just to perceive something, especially a voice, brings the ego back present. Rather than being like in the chaos that otherwise they live through. But when they're by themselves, one of the way they try to escape the trauma, let's say that, is by remember their life, and like trips is something that, travel is something that, because it gives also the movement, because it's also the lack of movement that causes this kind of situation. Perception plays an important role. So the memory of the past, the problem is that especially when the captivity is very long, captivity starts to dismantle the memory. And so they're losing that too. They're losing any kind of past. There is no perception of time. It's kind of been stuck, frozen. So their ego is also frozen. So the movement and memories start to disappear as well. Another way is to create dialogues. God is one of the ways to escape. Many of them becomes really like believers. Or, for example, for Carla Ovazza, who was one of the author here, she creates a dialogue with her friends. She's a Jewish, she belongs to a Jewish family, Carla Ovazza. And one of her friends was in Auschwitz. And she remembers, she narrates her experience in her memoirs. And this dialogue is so you see how trauma works and how testimony works. And she's the one that really wanted to testify when she was liberated, because of the importance of testimony in that sense as well. The testimony, her friend helped her to endure what she went through. So she created that kind of dialogues. Others start to talk to animals, because they're in the forest many times. These kind of captivities are really hard, right? So they start to create imaginarily a figure, or like animals in nature, they start to talk to them. So they endure, they create many different ways. The problem is they cannot read. And sometimes when they language is always the things that bring back the most. So if sometimes they give them something to read, they read 1,000 times the same things, the point they'll memorize them. And Montelero, for example, starts to translate them, because he speaks several languages, and it gives him a sense of movement and therefore being present. But yes, my answer is yes. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question, please, Ruth. Ruth?
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to put up the raise hand function. Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question for, I guess, both Alessandra and Georgia. So I remember reading a while ago, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the person, but it was someone who was taken captive in Nigeria. And as you said, she becomes very close to her captives. And one of the added kind of traumas of being then freed later on is that her family and friends keep telling her that she's very unwell, because she tells them about this sort of semi-friendship she has with her captives. So my question is, like, can we see this relationship with captives as somehow ethical, or is it just, does it completely blur the standards of right and wrong? To how far can you take it, let's say? And this is really present in Levy too, to a certain degree. I mean, in different ways. So, I don't know. Who would like to answer?
Georgia, do you want to go first, or okay? So yeah, this is the kind of big questions about this kind of bond that they create. I think that there is not a singular answer to this kind of question, because these are relationships, and even if we can analyze them, each of the situations are different, of course. And there are, for example, I'll give you the example of Giuseppe Soffiantini, who is the last memoir I show. He knows that was an extreme condition. He knows that he suffered a lot because of his warders, but because for him, for example, to write something was extremely important. They denied him to write, like he could not write while he was in captivity. When his kidnappers, who was like bandits, Sardinia bandits who lived in Tuscany, he was in prison because they got him after Soffiantini's kidnapping, and he was writing poetry, right? Soffiantini published his poetry, so he took care of it because he knew what it means to be in that situations and not be able to write. So he published what his kidnappers were writing during his own captivity. So, I mean, I don't think that we can say if it is ethical or not ethical. It is what it is. For Soffiantini, became a way to get himself free. So sometimes there is something that we cannot understand because it happened between the two things. Of course, sometimes it is an abusive kind of relationship. So these questions are also the same kind of question we can ask like in a kind of abusive kind of relationship. But as long as I think that the bond is healthy for the person involved, I don't think we can judge. That's my point.
Giorgia?
Yes, I completely thank you for your question. It's a very crucial one, and so I completely agree with Alessandra about the problem of the ethicity, the morality, about this kind of co-implication in the relationship between the captive, the prisoner, and the torturer. So in Levi's, of course, there's a big question of the gray zone, la zona grigia, to whom the Giorgio Agamben also wrote about it, about the zone of indistinction between so to speak, morality and immorality and amorality in a way, so in which the two are co-implicated like in a device. For this, so in my idea, so in Levi's work is actually this problem of the grigia macchina, actually this problem of the mechanic process of annihilation that can triggers also this kind of gray zone, the grigia zona, the zona grigia. So is because of the loss, in a way, because of the loss of humanity that involved captives, prisoner in the Nazi camp. Because of that, they are in a way forced to enter in contact and be implicated with the torturer. So I think it's very difficult to decide if there's a sort of responsibility, human responsibility in being with, and is being with the torturer, is it really being with, or is a sort of strategy, for example, to escape for the body or for the mind, is a sort of way to feel himself alive again for a prisoner in Nazi camp, or is the way to survive in a way. So it's impossible to criticize that, and many questions to Levi about why captives participate, not all of those, of course, but part of them participate to the massacre in the Nazi camp. So I think it's no answer question. It's a question with no answer, actually, because of this sort of automatic process of dehumanization. This is my way to link the grigia macchina with the gray zone. So a very complex co-implication, and I can understand very well that the prisoner can feel himself very guilty of that. And mostly if the via this kind of things he will survive about it. So it's is a big question, is a crucial question, and I think so. You know, I hope I answered you in any way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've got, oh yes, please, we've got time for a couple of more questions. Eleanor, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for these papers. I'm kind of, I guess, building on this discussion that's just come up, because across all three papers, I found myself really thinking about the blurred line also between survivor and victim, or survival and victimhood. And I'm struck by that, especially because you're all talking in different ways about forms of testimony. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the narrators in these works are positioning themselves in and sort of navigating that blurredness between surviving and being a victim. And then also if you could think also about how you are approaching the works too, like in your own approach to it, how do you see the subjects here? I'm just sort of asking in general. I don't know who wants to take it up. I was interested especially in Alessandra's comment that the works are, you know, in a clear way written after, so instead of during. So maybe that's an interesting point to start in terms of positioning.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Maybe I can start from the last part of your question, the fact that they write after, and it's so there is this one. I mean, it's a particular kind of captivity, the one in Rains and Kidnapping. So I think that's also where we can, you know, create a kind of a diversity among the different kind of testimonies, also based on the kind of experience they live through. And even within the victims of ransom and kidnappings, there are differences, of course. But there is also something that we can recognize in the kind of dynamics and the fact, and one of the things is that they write after because they are not allowed. The fact that they're not allowed to write and read in the captivity has already an impact in the way they write their memoirs, because the language becomes their testimony when they write, basically. They're lacking the kind of linguistic reflexivity during the captivity. So that what they are trying to do when they write it is I call them, that's my approach to the memoirs, I call them the writing of the return, which means that they write when they come back, but at the same time they write in order to go back, and to go back and become visible to themselves through the language. Because also the kind of deprivation, sensorial deprivation, they cannot see their kidnappers in face. They're always blind. So for me, it's very interesting, for example, the kind of acoustic perception in the memoirs, because they cannot see in reality during their captivity. So they go back, it's writing of the return, because they write from home, let's say that, but also they return to their hiding place. And the negotiation about, and then I can go back to the ethical question because it's connected to your question, Eleanor. And that is why also I think it's very important not to judge. They testify to their relationships they create with their, because it's a big deal, because they go back to society, in a society in which they can be judged. And one of the reasons why they can be judged is because basically they started to not believe their family and become kind of connected to their warders. I'm talking general here. It's not for everybody like that, but for the vast majority, yes. So the point is, like, the way they write, for example, it's the style they adopt is confession, and that it says a lot, because they confess their trauma as if they're afraid for two reasons. One, because it's the power of the warder that's still present, even if they are no longer in captivity, right? So they are oppressed. It was in isolation, so the only way to speak is by EOS, the confession style, and they're talking to us, they're listening, and so they're confessing as something that we cannot understand. They try to make her understand what happened, because journalists and any other kind of narrative cannot explain what the actual experience of being kidnapped is. And I close because otherwise I can talk forever.
I'm just, we're sort of almost drawing to the close, but I just wanted to see whether Marina or Georgia had something to add to this.
Yes, a little. So I try to be very short. Thank you so much for your question, and a crucial one, because Primo Levi tries, for example, to write about his experiences in Nazi camp in my opinion, for the whole literary production he wrote. So he starts writing Sequestro un Uomo in notes during the captivity, and then just after he wrote Sequestro un Uomo, And so the question is where Primo Levi, as a narrator, witness, survivor, plays himself in his kind of testimony literature. I think that at first, very, very schematic, at first, Se questo uomo is not only a testimony production, a testimony literary space, but it's something more than that, because it's the way Primo Levi would escape from the situation of captivity that he feel on himself even after experienced in Nazi camp. And many moments, the Canto di Ulisse, for example, about the humanity, the impossibility to giving up about humanity in this demolition of humanity process. And in many passages in Se questo uomo, there's the very strength willing to stay human, to be human, to conserve that. And so we know that it will be very difficult to Primo Levi to keep it. And in a way, also in a biographical way. So, and also because the whole literary production, for example, the science fiction story Levi wrote, or passages in La Tregua, or in I Sommersi e I Salvati, and also in La Chiave a Stella, there's a sort of mood, a sort of basso continuo about the Nazi rhythm, the Nazi persistence. And this is a sort of very sad thing, because we know that Levi cannot escape from that. And so his situation in a philosophical way and in a setting way, it's a situation to trying through literature to escape from the Nazi camp. Not only it's impossible, but it becomes a sort of mechanic repetition of the experience through the whole literary production. What I think. I hope I answered you.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Marina, is there any is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, maybe I see time is over, but I just would like to add a little.
Would allow us another minute or two, do you?
Okay, thank you. Just I would like to add just a small thing, because the question is crucial in Basaglia and all the passion from psychiatric words, of course, but there is a link that I would like to stress between Basaglia and psychiatric novel and experience and Primo Levi, because maybe you remember that Basaglia in 1967 put a quotation from Primo Levi on the back cover of his Che cos'è la psichiatria, one of the bestseller of the age. And there is a question between Primo Levi and Basaglia on this, what means to be a survivor of a psychiatric ward or a camp, a lager camp. And they don't agree, of course, because Levi say, okay, I can see there is something similar, but they are not psychiatric hospitals are not machine created to destroy, to kill. And maybe it could be a consequence, but it's not written. So, but Basaglia keep quoting Primo Levi for all his life, in all his writings. And so this is really not a good question to think about because they see, they study, and they write about the experience of surviving from a different point of view, but at the same time they have something in common. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's an excellent way of concluding a session by actually thinking about something that remains unresolved. I think I'd be proud of that. So thank you very much indeed for all this and the stimulating discussion. And so now we can have a piccola pausa.